So we're talking about the election of 1860, the election of 1860. As we know, presidential elections take place in the month of November. Let me give you sort of a timeline of events as of how close the Civil War is to this election. So in November of 1860, Abraham is elected to the presidency of the United States. In December of 1860, so toward the end of the year, in December of 1860, that is where you start getting the first states saying they are exiting the Union. They vote themselves out. They have a vote within their state to say, in a convention, to say that they are no longer part of the United States. Now, the United States government does not agree that they can do that, but that's part of the issue, is what's the legal situation here? In addition to that, how should this situation be handled practically by the states, by the government of the United States, by the governments of the individual states? What if you were in a state that voted in a convention to leave the United States, but you personally didn't want to leave the United States? There are all kinds of legal questions. Of course, can your state legally do this? Right? That's the big question of the Civil War, which the Supreme Court never gave an answer to or anything. It's settled in a way by the fighting of a war, but not really in a legal reasoning according to the Constitution, because the Constitution doesn't say anything about this process of secession. However, what the Constitution is a document outlining a federal government for states that choose to join it under certain requirements. So remember, states had chosen to join together on a team with a federal government in Washington, eventually in Washington, D.C. And so now the question was, well, if we chose to join 80 years ago, could we choose to unjoin ourselves 80 years later? Now, during December of 1860, South Carolina down here early on is the first state to declare itself outside now of the United States. South Carolina is saying now that it is its own country. Several other states soon after that declare themselves to be out of the country as well. But other states remain part of the Union, but would later exit. And we'll talk about that in a second. A few minutes here. Now, after that, the federal government of the United States sent in ships to reprovision a fort in South Carolina. The fort belongs to the United States government and the United States military. And so this reprovisioning this fort was seen as an act of war. South Carolina fired on them, which we'll talk about. Nobody dies. It's not a real battle. But then the United States government starts preparing itself and recruiting people to go to war against the states that have exited and to force them to stay part of the Union. Because of those actions, several other states leave as well, like Virginia, and some of these other states kind of in the middle here, but are still considered in the South. They exit after the United States starts getting ready for war. Then the first actual fighting is in April of 1861. So these events happen fairly closely together within a matter of months. You can think back, we're in April now. So we're getting to pretty much the anniversary of when the fighting started in the Civil War. And the Civil War would last until 1865. But you can think back to just a few months ago, around Christmas was December, and November was a presidential election in this year. So imagine from the election time until now, events are precipitated where the United States is at war, not with another country, but is at war with itself. The United States government officially recruits people from other states to go to war against states that have attempted to exit the Union. Now, how does the election of Abraham Lincoln contribute to this? One of the things people say is that Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, it's a little bit more complex than that, and we're going to look at his Emancipation Proclamation and what it actually did and did not do. Lincoln is responsible for the pushing forward and the signing of the 13th Amendment, which does officially bring slavery to an end in the Constitution. And Lincoln is assassinated soon after that. However, Abraham Lincoln, as he became president, as the first Republican president, he was of this newer Republican Party that had abolitionists, kind of certain business interests and political interests from the old political party of the Whigs, who liked to use government spending on projects like infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, those type of things. And so the newly constituted Republican Party was kind of a mix of these different things. And we're going to talk about some of the policies of the Republican Party at another time and what it was. But Lincoln is the first president of the Republican Party, which is still officially with us today, which is a little bit different, just like the Democratic Party is still with us today, but is quite a bit different as well. Now, was Lincoln an abolitionist who wanted to bring slavery to an end politically where it existed in the southern states? And the answer is no. Lincoln did not want to bring slavery to, or he believed slavery was wrong in theory, but his political policy was not to try to use the US government to try to make slavery illegal. Now, there were also some things that were happening from the US government in favor of slavery, in protecting slavery from the US government. The Constitution had the Fugitive Slave Clause, which said that free states had to return escaped slaves from slave states. There were also several tighter fugitive slave laws that were enacted during this time to try to get the free states to comply, because a lot of them did not agree and did not enforce the laws about returning escaped slaves, runaway slaves. In addition to that, the Congress was working on an amendment called the Corwin Amendment that we've looked at, that almost became the 13th Amendment, that promised that the US government would not interfere with the domestic institutions of a state, which meant that it would not interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. In addition to that, 1857, which we looked at a little while ago, the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court declared that since slaves were legally property, that they were property even in free states, which meant that slaves could be brought theoretically from slave states into free states, which meant that that free states where slavery had declared slavery illegal, where slavery had been declared illegal, could no longer effectively be enforced. And so you had the Constitution, the Congress, and the Supreme Court emphasizing certain things that would protect slavery and not interfere with it. Then Abraham Lincoln came to the presidency. Abraham Lincoln was against slavery in principle, and he did not want slavery to expand. However, he was fine with slavery continuing to exist where it existed. If you look at my mouse here, slavery existed below and in all these states that I go over with my mouse. Okay, so slavery existed all through here. So the South technically comes all the way up to here. Slavery existed for a long time, and the slave trade existed for a long time in Washington, D.C., where the capital is, right up here in Maryland. Maryland, where Washington, D.C. is, the White House, the Capitol building, all that, the U.S. federal government is in Maryland. It's a slave state, which was going to exit the Union, but it was stopped forcibly from the federal government being so close. But Virginia, right next door to it, did leave. But all these states had slaves. Okay, so Lincoln was fine with slavery continuing to exist, but he didn't want it to continue to expand west. Okay, and he didn't want it to expand, to any other land that was gained by the United States. Now, the slave states thought this was unfair, and this was one of the reasons why they were upset. It's because they felt they were being artificially limited by that type of thing. Now, Lincoln says he will not fight a war over slavery. He will use slavery later on in the Civil War to try to accomplish certain political and military goals, like the Emancipation Proclamation. But he does not become president with the goal of ending slavery. He becomes president and certain states exit the Union. What does Lincoln say that he will use the military to do, however? Lincoln says directly and explicitly that he will use the federal government to collect taxes from the states that have declared themselves independent and claimed to exit the United States. So he says, I'm not going to use the military to end slavery, but I will use the military force to collect taxes. And so this becomes part of the equation of the Civil War as well. And it becomes part of the justification for the northern invasion of the southern states. And then there are sides in this that there's the North, the South, but then there's also states that have slaves that don't fight for either side and who don't, they are neutral as far as the North or the South in this war, the United States versus the Confederacy. Now, why does Lincoln's election, if he's not planning to end slavery and has said that, why does his election precipitate so many states exiting from the Union, starting with South Carolina? Well, look at the votes. So the United States operates off of something we've talked of before. When they elect the president, we as the individuals do not directly elect the president through a national popular vote. And whoever gets the most votes of the people win. We have as many states as there are, we have that many democracies. And then the vote of each state is counted up, and certain amounts of points are given to a candidate. And if a candidate gets a certain amount, they will win. Today in our time, a president needs 270 what are called electoral votes to win. That's the points here. Now, in Lincoln's time, it was a lot less because there were less people and less states in the Union. Now, Lincoln did win. Okay, he did win the electoral vote. There are a lot more people in these states, and therefore the numbers, the points are propped up. They are higher than these states that may have more land, but are less populous. Okay, Lincoln did clearly, according to the constitutional rules, win the presidency. However, in terms of the popular vote, Lincoln got over 1.8 million, but in percentage of the popular vote, he got just under 40%. Okay, now if you think about that, the popular vote is not what makes someone a president, but sometimes it is important to look at. Okay, in fact, I'm going to bold that because it is something to think about here. That 40% means that there's another 60% of people that voted. And that means 60% of people that voted, most of people who voted did not vote for Abraham Lincoln. Yet, Abraham Lincoln became president. Well, that's true. He got the needed electoral votes. He won instead of what's called a majority, he won what's called a plurality. He got the biggest section of votes. But everyone else who voted in this election voted for someone else who was not Abraham Lincoln. Now, they didn't all get behind one person. If these, some people voted for these different parties, the blue light party, the green, these colors, the light, not the blue light party, but this was Stephen Douglas. He's a version of a Democrat. Bell was the Constitutional Union Party, and Breckinridge was a different type of Democrat. So there were Democrats that were divided in North and South. There were some people in here who wanted kind of this Constitutional Union Party. So they didn't get all behind one person. But here is why it contributes to the Civil War. The Southern states have less people in them. Now, here's how the constitutional government works. There are three branches. Branch number one is Congress, and Congress breaks into two parts. One part, called the Senate, all the states are totally equal. All the states are totally equal. They each get 2 senators no matter how big or small their state is. But in the other side, the House of Representatives, they get more people. Their state gets more representatives if they have more people in the state. So the North had a lot more people in it. And therefore, they were more powerful in the House of Representatives. Now, for a while, slave states and free states have a balance. 2 senators each and even number of states. And remember the Missouri Compromise, that when it joins the Union, it wants to come in as a slave state, it's going to throw off the balance. So they added the state of Maine to keep the balance. Then, so there's that. There's the Supreme Court, and then there's the presidency, right? So over time, there's this fight for balance of power between the states. Who's going to have their way and who's going to do so through controlling the US government? So Lincoln becomes president, but he becomes president without a single Southern vote. Not one of the Southern states had any of their electoral votes go toward Abraham Lincoln. Yet Abraham Lincoln won anyway. Now, as the Southern states start looking at this map and the results of the 1860 election, they now realize these states can elect a president without them. The free states can elect a president without the Southern slave states. And that means they now have control, arguably, of a big part of the Congress and the presidency. And therefore, these states, a lot of them feel vulnerable in terms of balance of power. They also feel like their institution of slavery is going to be threatened. And so they take the risk and they exit the Union. Okay, now here's the progress of secession. These are Union states. The red ones are Union states. They always stayed part of the Union. But there were also border slave states that did not secede. These states stayed part of the Union, but they did have slavery. Now, when Lincoln issues his Emancipation Proclamation, he does not free the slaves in the Union that are still in states that are loyal to the United States. He attempts to free the slaves in states that have exited the United States. So as one person said, you could have slavery as long as you were loyal to the United States. And another person said as well that, look, he tried to free slaves in the area where he had no control, and he didn't try to free slaves in the area where he had control. Okay, but there were these border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that had slavery but never left the United States. Then there were states that seceded. We'll go down to these blue ones. The states that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter. Okay, so these states exited after Lincoln became president. Okay, well, what about these ones? Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. What about them? Well, they were planning on most likely staying part of the Union. But after Lincoln sent in the military to re-provision a federal military fort in South Carolina called Fort Sumter, and South Carolina viewed this as an act of war and fired on them, and then the United States started getting ready for an invasion against these states, these other states said that they would exit as well. So because of the US government reaction, these states were pushed into exiting the Union. And remember, not every individual in all these states is wanting to do that. This is the decision of a convention and their governments to do that. So imagine if you were in a state that exited the Union, and now the United States is making war against your state. What would you do? And this becomes more complicated because these states, particularly, were all the 13 original states that declared independence with the Declaration of Independence. So now they just say, we're declaring independence again. This is the whole principle on what we fought for in the American Revolution. If we can declare independence from Britain, we can recall our own sovereignty and declare independence from the United States as well. And so there's this fairly simple, compelling legal argument for secession. And so this is what makes the Civil War so intricate, is that, and difficult, is that it's not just as simple as states exited and a war was fought to stop them from having slaves. It's that states exited with the focal point being on slavery, with the argument that they have the right to exit because they just did it 80 years ago from Britain. And now they're just asserting the right that was said to be possessed by all of them in 1776.